very good afternoon, a very good evening, a very good morning to you all, depending on where you are tuning in from. A very warm welcome to this particular panel on the power of youth, harnessing the strength of students for institution building and community impact. We are very, very fortunate to have with us four very distinguished panelists. And briefly, I would like to talk about the panel. What is it that the panel is going to focus on? I will introduce the panelists also briefly, and then we can move on to the discussion. We have with us today Professor Dr. Charmaine Dean, Vice President, Research and International, University of Waterloo, Canada. Professor Joe Chicharo, Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, University of Wollongong, Australia. Professor Dr. Peter-André Alt, President, German Rectors Conference, Germany. Professor Dr. Shepard, President and Vice Chancellor, Western University, Canada. We are so very happy to welcome all of you to this panel. To briefly introduce the panel and the conversation that we have been having in this conference about the universities of the future. Now, a conversation on university of the future is sort of incomplete if one doesn't talk about institutional building. And institutional building, as we have been engaging with in the past few sessions, is not only about high quality education, research, international exposure, but a huge and significant aspect of institutional building is partnerships with the local community. It is critical for universities to connect their students with the local community, to assist them to understand the issues that exist in the community, to equip them to develop a sustainable model that will aid in the solution of these issues. So how do we develop a mutually beneficial relationship with local communities and envisage the pursuit of a shared goal? Some universities have set up extension offices where students can use their research knowledge and skills to help the local community. In turn, students will also get some kind of practical experience. These extension offices, which are normally situated outside the campuses, are dedicated to assisting individuals, local industries, and local communities in resolving issues, developing skills, and establishing a brighter future. They seek to increase human capacity through education programs and technical information that results in improved knowledge and habits, as well as through system and infrastructural development. These extension officers are devoted to solving water, health, food, community vitality, leadership development challenges, a host of issues, thereby harnessing the power of the youth for community engagement. So this particular panel would discuss how should universities harness the strength of students and promote research for knowledge production and tangible community impact. So that is what we are going to be focusing on for this particular panel. We have a set of questions. I'm going to open with the first question, and we're going to go to each of the panelists, and each of the panelists could perhaps give their comments, ideas, and thoughts for around 3-4 minutes. We would try and move from question to question, and last 15 minutes, we would try and keep a Q&A. Now, the first question that I want to open with, that I want to throw to the panelists here, is what kind of strategies can universities adopt to mobilize students for institution building and community services? How will we need to rethink such initiatives of student engagement in the post-pandemic world? If I may start with Professor Dr. Charmaine Dean.
Thank you so much. I want to give a little bit of context about the University of Waterloo. And in fact, most universities right now are engaging in this sort of activity. We were built by business leaders from our local community with a clear emphasis that students need to be trained both in the classroom and in the community. So we call it a co-op program, and all the institutions represented here have similar sorts of co-op and internship programs. It's really fundamental to the training that we provide, that the students alternate experiences, work in the community, bring that back to the learning environment at the institution, and then cycle through that through the whole career. So at the end of the career at the institution, we're talking maybe 6 co-op experiences outside the institution. The nice thing about this is that there's a feedback loop. There is an opportunity for our faculty members to talk about the experiences outside. We have 22,000 students every year outside the institution to talk about what they're doing, and then reframe the learning environment academically in order to support what we see the community needs. And of course, there are a variety of programs that will integrate students' ability to perform well in the community through, work experience programs, developing CV, professional training, etc. So I know that this is also true at the other institutions, but given that it is fundamental to the University of Waterloo, I thought I would highlight it right at the start.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Charmaine, for that. And it is, I think, 2 things that I take away from what you said. One is that the emphasis that University of Waterloo places on experiences both inside and outside the classroom. And I think what is also interesting is what you spoke about, the feedback loop. Where there is a possibility of reframing and constantly looking at the goals and the way to achieve them by being part of this feedback loop where the faculty and the students involved in this process together. So thank you for that, Professor. May I go to now Professor Dr. Peter-André Alt for his views on the question.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. When I go back in my personal memory to the time when I was a student in the late 70s, early 80s, I remember well that we had a lot of time. We had study obligations which were not that tight, and this enabled us to actively to promote our interests either in political field or in social obligation. Now things are much more perfectly organized, and the study programs are focusing on such kind of practical experience. And when I take a look at the study programs of my university, I've been president of between 2010 and 2018, Freie Universität Berlin. 15% of our bachelor program components are consisting of internships, enabling the students to gather practical experience, to win practical experience, either in NGOs or in private industries. These practical components are very important. They have to learn about the working environments they are facing later after they're having accomplished their studies, and they have to report on that. And the seminars are offering enough platforms to exchange experiences. So I think this has been a kind of formal process within the reform of the study programs in Germany, which were theoretically focused in the 70s and 80s. And then we had this change via a reform process in the late 90s, last century, focusing on much more practical experience, according to the fact that a permanent increasing ratio of young people was going to university, was being enrolled, and they were aiming at gathering more practical experience than further generations. So I think this is quite a good idea to organize this in the study programs, to offer hands-on experience, regardless whether you are enrolled in social sciences, humanities, or sciences and engineering. In engineering, we had always this internship components, but now this is a comprehensive dimension as a part of the syllabus of instruction, and this works quite well. And the young generation is not only interested in that, they are demanding such components. And my generation was much more theoretical focused. Now we learn from the students interventions, that we must offer such coursework and such components in our study programs. And I think a second component is the political interest of students, but this is left to another question, I think, and we can discuss this a little bit later, because outreach is not only about practical experience, it's also about social commitment in general, I think.
Thank you so very much. Yes, absolutely. I think that the orientation of the way educational institutions are now looking at internships, looking at practical experiences that students have as part of their curriculum, has certainly changed. There is more and more focus, and there is more and more demand by students increasingly to be able to be part of such practical experiences. So, so to speak, to bring theory and praxis together is something that is increasingly the focus of academic curriculum in educational institutions, particularly in educational institutions, higher educational institutions today. And perhaps it is also important and that we take this up for conversation at a later time in our discussion as to how much of this emphasis on this practical experience stems from the need to have practice-based knowledge, but also at the same time to have, comes from a sense of social commitment, comes from a sense of a social commitment to engage with the communities within which we live. So with that, I would like to go to Professor Joe Chicharo to kindly hear his comments.
Thank you. Like Waterloo and what Professor Charmaine Dean said, University of Wollongong is very similar to Waterloo. In fact, when you look at Wollongong, it's a heavy industry and mining city, and the university, the city actually lobbied to have a university be established at Wollongong in order to serve the local community. So right from its inception, the university, the DNA of the university was around community engagement. And, I just want to take a slightly different tack just to talk about our approach. It all comes down and boils down to what sort of relationship a university has with its student body. And at Wollongong, I think the staff, and particularly the academic staff, take community engagement very seriously and institutional building very seriously. And we see our students as an extension of staff. So when you look at our strategic plan, right at the epicenter of that strategic plan, we say that we see our students as trusted partners. In other words, an extension of the university. And we actually see that we have a shared responsibility for their educational journey, which obviously means engaging with community, getting experience, real life experience, and blending that with the educational experience that the university provides. So I think it's a symbiotic relationship between what the staff are trying to do in terms of its institutional building, community engagement, and allowing the students and empowering the students to also contribute to that. And I think the community embraces that very well. And so I think in many ways, we're a living embodiment of this concept.
Thank you for those thoughts. I believe the point that I take away from your insights is that the relationship between university and the student community, and you spoke of that as a relationship which is based on trust, a relationship which is a shared relationship, it is a partnership, and therefore it is a shared responsibility. And I think it is an interesting point to be made, and particularly, and I think in the next round we can perhaps take this up in view of the pandemic. How do we see a shift in this relationship? Do we see a shift in the relationship between the universities and the local communities and the engagements that are there in place? Does the pandemic pose a challenge, or does the pandemic come as also something that provides an opportunity to a more enhanced kind of engagement with local communities. Perhaps this is something we could talk about in light of this comment about the relationship of university and the student body in one hand, and the relationship between the university student community and local communities on the other. With that, I would like to go to Professor Dr. Ellen Shepard for his comments on this question.
Thank you so much, and pleasure to be with you all. Before I moved to London, Canada, I was in Montreal, where I was president of another university for 7 years. So I'm starting my 10th year as university president. And what strikes me about working in both of those communities is how deeply important it is to the local community to have these partnerships and this engagement. Professor Alt said students are demanding these relationships, and I agree with that absolutely. I'm interested in the history of higher education, at least higher education in the West. I don't know as much about Indian higher education, but it's clear if you look over the last, say, 1,000 years, most universities started out as places where you had a gate around the institution, and the idea was to retreat from the community, to go inside to make special knowledge. And now, 1,000 years later, it's just the opposite. It's not to retreat, but it's to be out in the community. We don't need to persuade students of the importance of these connections, but sometimes I think we still need to persuade community leaders and industry leaders. There are those industries that have had long engagement with our students around internships, co-op programs, and so forth, but there are many, many other opportunities that we're still missing, feels to me, that we're still missing to engage it locally in our community building. So some disciplines, engineering notably, business typically, have very strong bridges already, but there are lots of disciplines out there where the students' educational experience would be so enriched, and the community would also be strengthened by finding new pathways. And so one of the focuses here at Western in our own new strategic plan is to ensure that all students who are studying at the university, we have about 40,000 students, that all students have a community building experience during their educational journey with us. And that includes humanities students, social sciences students, and so forth. So while some of them, the pathways are obvious, if you're a nursing student or you're a commerce student or whatnot, medical student, but if you're studying in the humanities, let's say, how can we provide a meaningful experience also for those students? I think it's a very interesting question as we kind of invert the university from the being huddled together to being out in the world. And I think also that has incredibly powerful political ramifications for how we're funded, how people see us, how the citizens want to help us as we help them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Shepard, for that. And I think it is important that you highlighted how significant it is from the point of view of the local communities as well, this kind of engagement, how it is equally important for local communities that these engagements are carried out. And with that, actually, I would like to flag the second question for the panel, which is how do you see this engagement that we're talking about in terms of institutional building, in terms of university and student engagement with local communities? How does this play out in the context of the pandemic that we are all currently experiencing? What role can the universities play in leveraging the intellectual capital available in terms of the large student population to support during such times of crisis? And what could be the possible challenges in engaging with community partnerships during times such as the ones that we live in? So Professor Dr. Charmaine Dean, if I could come to you first to hear your thoughts on this question.
Thanks very much. One of the interesting features of our strong emphasis on the core program is that as students move in and out of the industry, I liked what Professor Chicharo said about the student-centered approach. What happens at our institution, we see that students come up with their own ideas. They not necessarily interested in simply working for industry, they are interested in fostering their own ideas through entrepreneurship and commercialization. And that's also, it's probably driven by our co-op focus, but it's also a fundamental at Waterloo. It's built on the competitive assets that we have with our bright students and also the students circling through the co-op experience and coming up with ideas, but it's also funneled through the whole IP policy that we have at the institution that's creator owned. So from students to faculty members, whatever ideas they develop are their own to push forward on. One of the interesting things that's happened through the pandemic is the pivoting of some of these. And I'd like to connect into also Professor Alt's comments about his youth and his political side and getting involved in governance. We know that students are really interested in the social side, and the sustainable development goals are becoming so important for all of our communities. One of our entrepreneurial offices is called Greenhouse, and it's an area where students have the opportunity to come up with ideas that will form sustainable communities. So it's all about entrepreneurship for sustainable communities. And the other thing that I'll mention here is that there's been a lot of pivoting in the pandemic to support our local communities. So we saw a lot of our entrepreneurs dropping their particular product for a while in order to develop new tools. So for testing groundwater, or simple things like developing a recess program for students who are in the schools, and to help the teachers, because the students are on Zoom all day long and the teachers are unsure what to do. So we had a whole variety of pivoting to help in the classroom, but also to develop recess programs, mental health programs. So I'd say that the entrepreneurship aspect of our students has really harnessed the strengths generally for our communities, and also socially, but also particularly during the pandemic, to see what do communities need and how can our young people help them.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it is fascinating how the pandemic has forced one, whether it is educational institutions or other such institutions, to actually think outside the box, to innovate, and as you said, to pivot into other modes of engaging with the community. For example, what you spoke about, engaging with sustainable development with the community, to helping teachers with the Zoom classes, and to bring out new ideas and innovations in order to be able to respond to the crisis that we have in new and imaginative ways. So thank you, Professor Charmaine, for that. May I go to Professor Dr. Peter-André Alt for his views?
Thank you very much. I think the pandemic and the social crisis which is derived from it gives us a very ambivalent picture also of students' commitment for social services. On the one hand, the crisis has hampered and confined social activities and has focused on more virtual approaches. We have many platforms in our universities discussing, debating strategies for later activities, for future activities. So we are collecting, we are shaping ideas. There's a lot of creativity, but the students are very much suffering from the fact that they cannot that actively promote their ideas, actually. We feel, on the other hand, an increasing motivation for social commitment. And I share Chairman Dean's impression and observation. Also in Germany, students are very active in helping campaigns. They are, for instance, instance, as students, volunteers helping in vaccination centers on campus. So we're trying to open German universities in the next semester in autumn. And we do this by actively promoting a vaccination campaign, particularly for students. And this goes by establishing centers on the campus, helped by university clinicians and many other supporters, and the students are very active here. And the students are also active in the issues which have been mentioned. Major topic is definitely sustainability. Many German universities have established green centers, many of them launched by students. When it comes to public outreach, I should also mention many activities in startups. So many startups are involved in energy questions, in ecology, in sustainability issues. So students are very active here. And I think we have to take advantage of these manifold ideas they bring on the table. It's quite easy, I think, to participate in this energy. We are trying to form certain contests of best ideas and sustainably establishing new startups, and we try also to be a role model. I think universities must be a role model here in sustainably providing energy and many other aspects of that. So I think there is a high potential. There is a high motivation, and even though the pandemic has to a certain extent blocked many activities, I think in a couple of months, I'm very optimistic here, we can really take advantage of the students' ideas and creativity in all these fields again.
Thank you for those truly optimistic views, which is, you know, it makes me think about when the second wave of the pandemic hit India, which was a devastating wave, which all of us had to go through. The students actually across universities in India, in many instances, came together, set up helplines, you know, for oxygen supply, for emergency healthcare. There were helplines being set up where you could call the students. They were directing people, all through online modes, but they did come together and, you know, sort of innovated and extended all kinds of support that could be extended at that point of time. So I completely agree and share with that optimism, and that there is high potential and there is high level of motivation that is there in the youth. And it is extremely important that that potential and that motivation be harnessed. With that, can I go to Professor Joe Chicharo to hear his comments on this matter?
Okay, thank you. Look, like all the other universities represented here, and many universities, the University of Wollongong also has a very rich cadre of initiatives and programs of students engaging with the local community. But I wanted to use, it's beyond what a single university does within its own community. I think that we've now, there are much more sophisticated things happening. And I'd like to draw the attention, it just came to my mind now that on the second page of our local newspaper today, there was a whole page on the 180-degree consulting group, which is a University of Wollongong group. Now, this group grew out of the University of Sydney. It was a single student in 2007, and the objective was to provide student expertise and experience as a consulting service, focusing on not-for-profit organisations, charities and social enterprises. Now, that since 2007, that this 180 degrees consulting group has expanded to about 170 groups around the world, and in 36 countries. And I know Waterloo is there, has got a group, I think Charmaine. I know that, for example, IIT Kharagpur and IIT Madras also has a group. Now, what the story that was in the newspaper today in Wollongong was that during the pandemic, the needs. This group has been doing a roaring engagement with these charities because they've been stretched to the limit. And so they've been doing a huge amount of work with the charities and the not-for-profits around business improvement and logistics because of just the impact of the pandemic. And before that, we also had some very significant devastating bushfires. So I think here's an example of the university creating its own community engagement platforms and mechanisms, but also sort of encouraging students to establish to engage with similar organisations in other universities where they share that knowledge globally. I mean, the impact of this group globally is quite significant. There's over 10,000 students engaged in this thing around the globe. So again, I'm just giving an example of community engagement and the power of students. And in this case, those that are focused on charities and not-for-profits and the contribution and impact they can make. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it is truly fantastic. Thank you for that. May I now go to Professor Alan Shepard for his comments on this question.
Thank you. Well, a lot's been said already. I thought I would add just one point, which was around the power of online outreach and how that's shifted in the pandemic for our students. So the Ivy Business School, which is one of our faculties here at Western, has historically offered Entrepreneurship 101, including social entrepreneurship. And we would typically have 30 to 40 students sign up for it and be working with local companies. And this year, we moved it all online. We made it free, and we had 3,500 different, and we opened it to alumni and other community members. And suddenly we went from 30 students to 3,500 some odd students. So just to say the reach of just even what we're doing today, talking to each other from all over the world, I do think that's a fundamental shift that will take root now and will accelerate after the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, this brings me to another important question. What all of you say, and rightly so, is that there is a lot of potential and possibility in the context of community engagement. The pandemic has thrown up challenges, but at the same time, it has opened up possibilities for innovation, possibilities for new ideas to find space, possibilities for entrepreneurship. So my question is that most universities at this point of time is either operating in a completely online mode or are in some kind of hybrid mode in which they're operating. So what are the ways in which universities can reimagine student-led community projects and services for social impact while working remotely? So one is the kind of response that you are talking about, all of you are talking about, particularly in the context of the pandemic, but there have been ongoing projects. There have been community engagements that students have been part of. However, now because of the constraints of an online mode or constraints of a hybrid mode of working, how does universities and student communities carry on with the projects that they had started? Or what are the ways in which your institutions have responded to this particular challenge that the current mode of working has thrown up? Professor Charmaine, if I could come to you first to get your response to this.
So I'll have to say, Upasana, that this was one of the most difficult questions. The mobility challenges have made it really difficult. You talked about community-based projects where, especially in the pre-discussion, you talked about communities that may not have the infrastructure for remote connectivity. How do we make connections? I think I'm going to draw on Professor Chicharo again here. I'll flip the question around because the question is challenging, and I'm really interested to hear what others have to say about being able to promote student research in this environment. One of the good things, there can anything be said as good, is the global connectivity. So we have students in a variety of countries who are not in Canada, studying from their remote communities. And there are differences in the scale of the pandemic across the globe at any one time. We have been able, and as I said, Professor Chicharo mentioned this, we've been able to draw connections across students who are interested in particular projects, connecting them in globally to, similar ideas that they would like to foster, and then been able to either hire support systems in a particular country to run a research program and share ideas across countries. And we've understood some of the challenges of this because, and actually these challenges are good for the students to face, because solutions in one area will not necessarily work in others. So helping the students understand that, although one of their team members is able to go out and produce a solution and to work with the community, would it actually be expected to fit in another area? So it's drawn on, it's a different approach. First off, it's a more global approach. And secondly, it brings different questions to bear. So having students being able to debate whether this makes sense or whether something new needs to be provided for a student in Africa or a student in the Caribbean. We have lots of students from the Caribbean, or we have lots of students in India as well. Do these approaches work? And then being able to draw on the differential impacts of the pandemic in the ability for students to actually go out and do community-based research. So I'm not answering the question specifically because I think it is difficult with mobility challenges to be out in the community. Especially if there's no remote infrastructure to support remote connectivity. But this is one of the ways we've been able to bring a global context to students and still be able to carry out research and debate whether, how research is useful in various contexts.
No, thank you, Professor. I completely agree with what you said, and perhaps there is no easy answer to this. And perhaps this is a right approach to take, to think about global connectivity, to think about students learning that what you very beautifully put out, that solutions in one area would not necessarily mean that the same solution would apply in all other areas as well. And the differential impact that the pandemic has had in ability and capacity of students to engage with the community. And perhaps on the other side of the coin, perhaps the question lies is that, is there in some way, and either you and perhaps any of the other panelists would at some point like to address this as well, and I'm thinking that, on the one side, there is this question of students not being able to do the kind of research they thought being able to do, but at the same time being able to innovate, think differently, so on and so forth. And other side, the institutions will also have to do community expectation management, in the sense that the communities also over a period of time, particularly in context of institutions that have been engaging with these communities for a period of time, have certain expectations from the institutions, have certain expectations in terms of, if there is a health project that was ongoing, if there was a water project that was ongoing, if there was some kind of communication and partnership that was ongoing, then there is expectations on the part of the community also in terms of certain deliverables by the institutions to the community. So isn't there an aspect of community expectation management as well, to talking about community engagement, local partnerships, particularly in the context of the pandemic. I'm just throwing it out there, perhaps one of you could address it at some point of time. With that, I would like to come to Professor Peter-André Alt for his comments.
Thank you. Upasana, this is really a crucial question, I think. On the one hand, I would fully agree in Charmaine's observation. There is a lot of chances in the process. First of all, universities globally have successfully established the technical infrastructure for hybrid or virtual solutions. And this had been enormous progress, and no one would have expected that this could be running that well. And I think the virtual communication enables a global interconnection and connectivity. And this also includes that teaching, learning, research are promoted by flattening hierarchies, by overcoming differences between the respective status groups. Open science is not only a promise, it has become reality. And I think we can build on that. This is very important, not only globally, but also with respect to the different roles within the science system. And this enables students much broader participation than in previous times. And this also includes a lot of new aspects of creativity and flexibility. And I think this enables universities much better to connect themselves, to overcome competition. Competition from an institutional aspect is important for global progress. But science in general is not competitive, it's teamwork in most cases. And this also includes different status groups. And this is much better realized by the new structures of communication in the virtual world now. The question how we can also contribute to social progress and to local communities by perspective of students and the general perspectives of the university staff is really crucial. And I think we have learned to globally connect our networks, as we can see here. I would not have attended this meeting, unfortunately, 2 years ago, but now I can, so it's great. And I think we have also to integrate members of different communities into our networks. That's very important, also into the virtual networks, to avoid certain bubbles, and also to be open enough and to learn about their expectations. And I think this is manageable, and we must manage this in the future. So we need more mixed groups, more heterogeneous groups, diverse groups, so that we can learn social expectations for realizing our third mission.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think two things that I'm thinking of when I hear you speak. One thing that you said, it's really very interesting, and I find is this idea of flattening hierarchies. I find that idea very interesting, which the pandemic has in some way done. It has a very deeply egalitarian approach, which made us all sort of take a step back and think about where we stand, what are the privileges that we take for granted, and what are the things that we cannot take for granted anymore. So I like this idea of flattening hierarchies that you speak about. And at the same time, and I'm sorry to pick out this particular point because it sort of spoke to me, at the same time, the pandemic has also talked about a different kind of hierarchy. For example, certain things that we take for granted, the fact that a student has enrolled in an educational institution does not guarantee that the student will be now able to continue to have access to the resources that was taken for granted. And particularly, if I talk in the context of India, caste, class, and religion, and other kinds of categories of social exclusions and particularly gender, have become so stark in the context of having access to resources in the context of the pandemic. And I think that is something has really stood out in the context of the pandemic, especially in a country like India. So I really think that there is merit to talking about what hierarchies got flattened and what kind of hierarchies got further exposed in the context of the pandemic. It's not that those hierarchies did not exist before, but it has become so much more pronounced in the context of the pandemic. With that, I would like to come to Professor Joe Chicharo for his comments.
Yeah, look, I don't have much to add other than to say that, you know, I think Charmaine put a finger on it. It's around, you know, working remotely has really exposed, like in many other parts, certainly at the University of Wollongong, where we have a large percentage of low socioeconomic students. And so the digital divide has really become pronounced in terms of their ability to engage and contribute when they're working remotely. So I think that that is something that the university is very conscious of, and we're actually trying to support students with the infrastructure to be able to do that. But it's a really tough problem because all of a sudden students felt equally empowered to contribute. Now, with the advent of the pandemic and their social circumstances, there is this, I think, this major challenge confronting us that probably places, I think, like India, you know, you've been living with that for some time, as you mentioned. And so we kind of trying to say, how do we actually solve this problem ourselves? It was something that wasn't really there for us. And I think it's actually quite a serious issue, and it's taking a lot of our time in terms of thinking about how we might address it. That's what I would say. I think it's actually a very important point in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the ability of students to engage and contribute in an equal way as far as possible.
Well, certainly. I do completely agree with you. Professor Shepard, may I request to come in?
Yeah, thank you. A lot's been said already. Maybe I'll take it in a different direction. When I think about my own education and what it would be like to be a student today, I think this is the most extraordinary time in human history to be a student. I think the access to higher education is stronger than it's ever been. I think that we take students seriously as co-creators of research and as people who can make independent engagement in communities that they live in or around the world. It's possible now through technology to have research partnerships that are quite real and fulsome and that are with partners literally around the world. The flexibility of curriculum and the ways in which people are teaching and learning now, I think it's the most extraordinary time. And the pandemic is for sure a setback in one ways. In other ways, as you were saying, Upasana, it's also brought to the fore kind of new techniques, new technologies that we'll all use going forward. But I think I'm incredibly optimistic about the role that students will play in the community engagement and in research, solving big problems that the world's facing. I think we have every reason to be just incredibly optimistic about where it's all going, I must say.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Shepard. It certainly is an exciting time to be a student right now. And it's also certainly exciting to be a teacher right now, to be a faculty right now, where you're constantly innovating, constantly learning, and constantly trying to adjust to the quote unquote new normal. With that, actually, we have certain audience questions that have come in. There are quite a few. I'm going to try and combine a couple. And because we have, around 10 minutes for this session to end, so it would be nice if you could take up some of the questions from the audience. So I'm trying to combine two questions together. Perhaps all of you can come in and briefly respond to the question so that we end on time. So two questions actually, and I'm combining the two, and both about institutional building and universities in the context of developing countries such as India. And the question is that how do universities in the context of developing countries harness the students' strength for institutional building and community impact? What are some of the strategies that can be adopted to harness relatively smaller student bodies and alumni networks to create community impact? And a connected question, and therefore I'm combining the two, as to what kind of role the students can play in curriculum building, in coursework. And do you think that alumni and existing students can play a role here in terms of curriculum building and coursework? So Professor Dr. Charmaine Dean, may I request you to respond to that, please?
Upasana, it looks like you may have lost Charmaine.
Yes, I believe she dropped out of the call. Well, one of the challenges that we can certainly see of the online mode. So Professor Peter-André Alt, may I request you to come in?
So please allow me to refer to our German experience. In Germany, as you might know, we do not charge tuition fees, considering the university's program as a public good, which is financed by the state, in most cases sustainably and also sufficiently. This causes a specific role of students. Students are constitutive members of the academic community, also being members of the academic boards, both of the Academic Senate and the Board of Trustees. And in the respective institutes, they are part of the working groups which are developing the curricula. So in German universities, no curriculum is finalized without contribution from the student side. So I think this is given by constitutive law and by the rules of the academic life. Both elements are important, and they are conditioning the framework for students' work here. I think this is very helpful because the students are not only on a, let's say, goodwill level, a part of the universities, they are indeed a part of the working processes, and there are no working processes concerning teaching and study conditions without contributions of the students, and this has been turned out very helpful, I think, in the last years.
Well, that is truly fascinating, and the fact that here the students become stakeholders in the true sense of the term, both in the ways and the courses are designed and delivered. Thank you. Professor Joe Chicharo, your thoughts?
Thank you. Look, I agree entirely with what Peter said. I mean, I think you've got to trust the students, and it takes a certain amount of maturity to be able to do that. Don't forget the students are both in the community and at the university. So I think if you trust the students and you empower the students, then they will naturally, I think, make a contribution. And like in Germany, the student voice at the University of Wollongong is very powerful. They're in all our major governance committees, in decision-making committees. Our academic highest committee for academic quality and standards is our Senate. 15% of the membership in Senate is actually students. And when you think about Senate, essentially they have the balance of power between the elected people and the ex officios. So in many ways, we have set up our academic senate so that students, when push comes to shove, can actually sometimes have the balance of power. And I think that's how, in terms of structurally how you organise, in terms of the institution, to listen to the students and empower the students, not just in terms of contribution to curriculum development and co-design, but also in decision making. So that would be my response.
Thank you. That is truly insightful, and I think it sort of gives a context like ours a lot of food for thought in terms of new and innovative ways of engaging students and making them stakeholders not only in the process of institution building, but in the process of designing and delivering the programs that we are currently running. Professor Shepard, your views, please.
So one of the things that happened about a year ago at Western, as we entered into the pandemic and it became clear that we would pivot for the fall and winter terms in terms of online learning, we hired 330 of our own students, a mix of undergraduates and graduate students, to help their faculty members convert their courses from in-person learning to online learning, 330 of them. It was a summer project, and there was an unintended consequence. We thought that these students would help them convert them, which they did. But the unintended and really joyful consequence was that the courses got remade. They weren't simply converted, they were refashioned, they were co-created with the students. And I think what I've heard from our faculty members who had the pleasure of working one-on-one with a student in their discipline was to be able to see the course through the eyes of the students very, very directly and upfront, not at the end of the semester when you get a teaching evaluation, but all the way through. So I think it was an extraordinary moment in curriculum building that we're likely to hang on to. We've refinanced the program again this summer, and it was very well received by the faculty. I can imagine a time when I was a student in which the faculty would have said, well, we're the faculty and we'll tell them what they need to know and how they should learn it, right? That's certainly my experience as a student. That was not the response of our faculty. Our faculty were terrific. And they were like, oh, we could work together. And now I can see what it, through the eyes of a 20-year-old who's coming to this discipline fresh, what are the questions they have and how would they organize the material? I think it was an extraordinary moment in co-creation of curriculum.
Well, it is truly extraordinary, and I would love to actually hear more about this at some other point. We do not have time on this platform, but I would love to connect and hear more about this. This is truly fascinating. And I think that we have Professor Charmaine Dean back with us. Hello, Professor. We lost you there for a minute. Thank you for joining us back. I would just quickly repeat the question for you because you dropped out of the call. We are taking an audience question, and one of the questions that the audience is asking is how developing country contexts like that of India can harness the potential of the students, smaller student bodies, and in institutional building and in community impact. And particularly, there is a question about what kind of opportunities that the students can be given to negotiate part of the course curriculum and coursework. And is there possibility to draw on the alumni network and also existing students? Can they play a role in this? So may I come to you, Professor Dean?
So just very briefly, and the joys of remote connection, my apologies. Love what I heard the last two speakers say. I wasn't able to hear Professor Alt, but in particular, Professor Shepard, maybe building on that. A lot of interest by remote communities on sustainability. I mean, Professor Alt talked about that earlier. One of the interesting things at the institution with the student leadership in the last year in particular, as Professor Shepard mentioned, is the students proactively defining what would be important in terms of programming as we move forward. And I'll give you just one example, and that is we have a School of Accounting. We have students in particular countries who are interested in sustainability, including Canada. And, the agility of the students and their needs meant that we needed to develop a new program on accounting, sustainable finance. And that brought together the Faculty of Environment students and accounting department to work together with the students to develop this new program, which is making its way through approval processes and about to be launched in the fall. So I'd say alongside Professor Chicharo, a lot of leadership from students on the sorts of programs they want And Professor Shepard mentioned being right up front in developing the courses, and testing them out. That's led to a lot of new programming at Waterloo and elsewhere. One other thing I'll quickly mention is leadership training. So we've been building on the last year on the needs for students to be more proactive with leadership training and also leadership awards through the President's Office. So allowing students the opportunity to, develop professionally as well as they work with the institution on new programs and in the communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Charmaine, for that. Actually, the idea of leadership training and leadership award is something I wish we had more time to actually talk about. But unfortunately, we do not. It's 6:30 and we have to close the session. I think two important takeaways, at least for me, from this session is about partnerships and building sustainable partnerships. And sustainable partnerships are built on trust. And built on mutual exchange. And I believe there are two kinds of partnerships that we spoke about here today. One is the partnership, of course, between the universities and local communities, engagement, bringing together theory and practice, allowing and enabling students to go beyond the classroom and experience the real world, to be able to apply what they have learned in the classroom in practical situations, and to seek community solutions, to seek solutions together, and to work in partnerships and in teams. And second, of course, is the partnership between the students and the university, which is a very important relationship that is built on trust and mutual respect. And I think we got very many insightful thoughts and ideas that we would like to take forward post this conference, and probably have longer conversations with each one of you and see what is it that we can learn from your experiences and bring it to the experience of institutional building here in India, and envisage the universities of the future in new and imaginative ways. With that, I want to thank each and every one of you. Thank you so very much for your time. We are truly grateful that you took out your time. We are thankful to technology that enabled us to have you with us here today. And at some point, perhaps, and not so near future, we would be able to host you at our university, and we would have the opportunity to interact you with all of you in person. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to continued interactions. Thank you. Thank you. The session is now closed.